In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Welcome to the kick-off of the series The Future of Capitalism, a series initiated and designed by VU Amsterdam in collaboration with Pakhuis de Zwijger. Over the past century, the capitalist model of the free market economy has demonstrated to be an effective vehicle to create wealth. However, in today's globalized world, the downsides of these models have become more and more obvious. Ecological decay, increasing inequality worldwide, inadequate resource allocations, and a new geopolitical power balance. The credit crisis of 2008 and more recently the corona crisis have further exposed these issues. To create an innovative, inclusive and sustainable economy, a market economy for generations to come, we need new values, new structures, and of course, new practices. We need to connect existing innovative ideas with newly formulated ones and bring together theory and bring it into practice. Through a series of 10 public online dialogues with visionary economists, this future market consultation aims to offer solutions and bring together researchers from all around the world to rethink capitalism. How can the freedom and innovative potential of free markets be squared with the requirements of ecological sustainability, social justice and inclusivity? In this kick-off, we explore how economics is at the basis of radical systemic change. How do global financial and economic system, climate change, human consciousness, social security relate to one another? How do these systems interact? And most importantly, how can we, without discarding capitalism in its entirety, transform them fundamentally? Today we have two guests, two very smart economists. Irene van Staveren, Pluralist Development Economics at the Institute of Social Studies. She's professor there of Erasmus University Rotterdam. And Professor Arnoud Boot, who is professor of corporate finance and financial markets at the University of Amsterdam. And we will discuss to them those fundamental changes we're looking for. To kickstart that conversation, we will present a column read out by Jim Suri on behalf of the think tank of young economists which are connected to this project. After that, the two renowned economics will be interviewed by my co-host David van Overbeek. And after that, we will discuss what is really relevant in changing the future of capitalism. We will close off this talk with Jim Suri again. Ladies and gentlemen, your attention for Jim Suri.
Systems are not changed mysteriously. They are transformed when there is a fundamental change in ourselves. G.D. Krishnamurti. Many genius scientists, like Albert Einstein, combined science with spirituality. Sometimes it's possible to understand the essence of a phenomenon by looking to the deeper spiritual layer of it. Krishnamurti, an Indian spiritual leader, knew this as well. Not only these individuals, but quantum physics as well, teaches us that there is a direct link between our physical perceivable reality and human consciousness. Thus, our current societal model is an effect of the collective consciousness. A paradigm shift within ourselves will therefore lead to a different society. This interaction is very hopeful, since based on these findings, nothing is fixed and everything can be changed. If I observe the current global society, I'm seeing a fragmented level of awareness. Humans are perceiving themselves as a self-containing entity without realizing that there is an interconnected link between them and everything around them. This type of egocentrism is a breeding ground for concepts such as competition, war, profit maximization, and the idea if everyone thinks about themselves, there will be thought about everyone. Next to this perception of independence within and between people, there's a broken connection between human beings and planet Earth as well. Our planet is currently being treated as a production unit because we see it as an option to fulfill our needs. Unfortunately, we are not able to cope with the effects. The vitality of our planet is declining. The biodiversity is vanishing. The quality of our soils declines. The nutritional value of our food is lowering. And there is environmental pollution. Due to this type of destructive behavior, we will destroy ourselves eventually. Additionally, humanity is sailing a slowly sinking ship named the financial system. And the only thing we try now is to repair the holes. It's clearly not working. We are playing a board game of Monopoly, whereby inequality is rising and wealth and power concentrates. Capital creates even more capital, but for most of the people, their labor force is only a means to survive. The balance between earning and getting is lost. This reality is further disturbed by a tax system, whereby labor is taxed more heavily than wealth, and due to national differences, capital automatically searches for places with the lowest taxes. Within this financial system, our monetary system is crucial. Although there is a negative interest rate and an abundance of money, we can speak of scarcity. Namely, money accumulated at a small group of people, while the majority of citizens, states, and companies have to cope with unsustainable levels of debt. Newly created money mainly stays within the financial sector, instead of a distribution to places where it's actually needed. Because of this, the financial sector is becoming more dominant, and the real economy serves the financial sector. In an ideal world, it has to be the other way around. However, money is currently limited our problem-solving ability because real problems are not being solved due to a lack of a fictional thing called money, while the real things like material and people are there. To change systems, I believe we must start with a fundamental change in ourselves. One of the co-founders of Sustainable Finance Lab, Klaas van Egmond, argues that we are currently focused on material things and the ego. To change that, we have to find a balance between the material and spiritual spectrum and the individual and collective spectrum. In order to make this happen, let's start by realizing that we're a part of a bigger picture, and due to this synergy, we can evolve. Consequently, we can pass through a positive transition where we work together via global cooperation instead of working against each other via competition. Some centuries ago, humanity appeared to be capable of modifying our moral compass in favor of all. For example, we abolished slavery and child labor. Even though this was economically speaking unfavorable for some, it was a positive development for many. In the more recent history, you can also see a fundamental paradigm shift. Last April, the chief editor of the Financial Times wrote that we must speak openly about the redistribution of wealth, basic income, wealth taxes, and more security in the labor market. These are signals which fit the current zeitgeist, because most of us just see that the current system is failing and there is need for something else. It's time to reset our moral compass again in order to create a global society model which benefits all living things instead of some of us. I'd like to close this introduction statement with the meaning of something which connects us all, namely the universe. Freely translated, it means all turns into one. My name is Jim Richard Suri, working for the Sustainable Finance Lab. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jim Suri. Let's go to our economists and the interview in the interview. And for that, I would like to give the floor to my co-host, David van Overbeek.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Ms. van Staveren, thank you for being here tonight with us. In this series, we explore how economics is at the basis of radical systemic change. And I'd like to kick off with getting a grasp on the most urgent and perhaps fundamental problems with today's economic system. Today, we live in a capitalist society. What do you think is the most common myth about capitalism? And can you debunk it?
Yes, I think there are two myths about capitalism. One, that we need capitalism in order to sustain our well-being, and particularly also to allow the well-being of people in developing countries. And again, there's another myth that the only alternative to capitalism is communism. And a state-run planned economy. And well, for this, we know how this ended. And of course, we should not want more of that. So what I would like to see is that people don't confuse capitalism with markets, or capitalism with well-functioning, effective markets. The interesting thing is that capitalism is an economic system in which the market dominates, but went completely out of balance with the coordinating supportive role of the state, the redistributive role of the state on the one hand, and with the role of communities on the other hand. So the market dominates. And I think the important insight, once you see that, is that we can have a very different economy that is not capitalist, but that still relies to some extent, to a large extent, on markets. So we can have a market economy that is not necessarily a capitalist economy.
All right. So why do you think that most people believe that a capitalist society should automatically go hand in hand with a market-sized society?
Well, that relates to economics as a science. When Adam Smith wrote about the role of the market, capitalism was developing, was emerging, but actually the system of feudalism was still very strong. So Adam Smith argued against feudalism and favored the role of markets. 100 years later came Karl Marx. And in his days, we've seen the downsides, the negative effects of a market economy that turned into a capitalist economy. So, yeah, what we can learn from that is rereading Marx's book Capital. I did that 2-3 years ago again, after I read it the first time when I was a student. I must warn people, it's terribly boring, it's badly written, full of repetitions. But what I decided to do is to read it between the lines. And then I discovered that it's not private property that is the major culprit of capitalism going wild, but it's two other mechanisms that characterize capitalism. So Marx mentioned two key characteristics of capitalism, which we can change without having to say goodbye to markets. So actually, I think it is a very optimistic way of looking at the problems of capitalism. So these two mechanisms. One is the asymmetry between capital and labor. Capital hires labor, and it's never the other way around. The other asymmetry, Marx compared the exchange in a general market, markets as we know them for thousands of years, that start with a good. So you start with a good. For example, you have an apple tree and that provides more apples than you can eat. So you start with the goods and you want to offer these additional apples to get something else in exchange, a good that is valuable to you, and so on. So the good is central, and that automatically, such exchanges automatically lead to mutually beneficial exchanges. In capitalism, however, the whole exchange starts, the sequence starts with money, with capital. And that is invested in no matter what, as long as it provides maximum rents or dividends or whatever return on investment for the investor. So that may be through producing goods, but as we've seen in the analysis of the financial crisis, it's not through producing real goods and services, but investing in all kinds of fancy financial derivatives. So if we address these two issues, exchange not starting with money and with goods as just a means, but with goods and money just as a means of exchange, and break through the asymmetry of capital hiring labor, then I think we can develop a market economy that is delivering well-being, much more equally spread, and it is also much easier then to move towards a more sustainable economy.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. van Staveren. So if I understand you correctly, there's a way of reading Marx without leading necessarily, which doesn't necessarily lead to communism, and from which the insights from Marx we can still use today in today's economy and in the way we think about economy.
Right, yes.
So one could say that change starts with the way we look at the world, and our worldview is obviously shaped to some extent by the education that we receive. And you, as a pluralist economist, have been vocal about the necessity of pluralism within the economic sciences. Why do you think that this particular neoclassical paradigm is so popular and so dominant within economics? And why do these insights, for example, from Marx, why are they so hard to find within economic sciences these days?
Well, there's not enough time to go into all the factors. But once one paradigm has become relatively more dominant, then starts a kind of vicious circle in which you are locked into that paradigm, and so a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. When I studied economics in the 1980s, there was still Keynesianism in the university, and indeed I could choose subjects on Keynesianism. Marx was not taught anymore, but John Robinson was invited, for example, to Erasmus University to give lectures. But yeah, since the 1980s and 90s, the neoclassical paradigm has become dominant. And the problem with that, with which we got stuck today, is that turned us blind and actually powerless and helpless to alternatives. When they are not taught anymore to students, then we deliver economists who have no idea about the richness of economic ideas of the past. So where should they start? And then they fall into the trap of this myth about capitalism, that first, capitalism and the market is the same, and obviously nobody wants to abolish markets. And second, that, well, if you want to do something like a different market along the lines of Marx, communism, state-led communism, the Soviet Union model is the only alternative. Yeah. So that's why I think it is so important, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important that economic education becomes much more diverse, with a variety of perspectives, also perspectives with which I, for example, would not feel familiar with or think it is in any way helpful to address the environmental crisis, for example. So the whole range, Smith, Marx, Robinson, Keynes, Veblen, but also the Austrians, Menger, for example. I think delivering a broader perspective to students will, in the end, generate better equipped economists in our society.
Lastly, Ms. van Staveren, what advice would you give to young people who want to study economics these days?
Be very critical to which economic department you go, and sometimes you're better off with an interdisciplinary department rather than with a purely economics department. And there are, for example, you can do bachelor's as well as master's in political economy, which combines economics and philosophy and political science. Or you could choose to go to a development school where I work, for example. Development economics is much more interdisciplinary. So I would advise students to make a choice based on comparing economics education within the Netherlands and outside.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, let's go to the second interview.
Let's do that. Mr. Boot, thank you very much as well for joining us tonight. We just heard from Ms. van Staveren that the common myth, according to her, about capitalism is that markets and capitalism always go hand in hand. What do you think is the most common myth these days about capitalism that you keep hearing? We can't hear you, unfortunately, Mr. Boot.
You have to accept your unmute button. Accept. Yeah,
okay.
We'll start again.
That's a new instruction. We are supposed not to do anything.
Yes. Okay, so start your answer again.
We'll start again with your answer.
The most common myth is that any type of system, any type of system always has side effects, and there are always people misusing the system. And if it comes to capitalism, first the question is, what is capitalism? And in my definition, capitalism is about individual initiative, that individual initiative is appreciated, that there is private ownership, and therefore you also need markets, because once you start with an individual and you start with this private initiative, private ownership, you do need markets. But what has capitalism in the general notion of capitalism? What do we have in mind? We always combine capitalism with competition. That capitalism, contrary to state planning, communist system, if we put that to the extreme, in capitalism we have competition. In state planning, we do not have competition, and therefore, at least typically, you would really have to organize it. We don't have competition, and therefore, a capitalistic system is more efficient. That's the common notion. That's a common notion of people that defend capitalism.
Yeah.
But what have we seen in the last 20 years? That the core purpose of corporations is to reduce competition, to prevent competition. And once competition is no longer part of the individual spirit, private ownership, the market economy, if you kill competition, then it means that you have people that do rent-seeking and they can misuse their position. So I find this element of competition absolutely crucial. And the second thing to emphasize is that capitalism, nor socialism, by the way, says anything about fairness, about distribution. One of the most famous laws that we have, or theorems that we have, is the first theorem of welfare economics. And the first theorem of welfare economics talks about Pareto efficiency. And Pareto efficiency is that there is an allocation that you cannot improve on without making somebody worse off. However, this whole notion doesn't say anything about fairness, about distribution. So any type of system, whether it's capitalism, socialism, etc., you need to take care of other concerns like fairness.
Thank you very much. So where do you think that this emphasis on competition within capitalism comes from? Because one could say that it is perceived as a hallmark of what it means to be a capitalist society.
That's absolutely true, because that's the if you talk to the mainstream American industrialist, He will always say the capitalist system is best. You know what? Whoever comes with an idea, and if that idea is superior, he gets the market. So the capitalist system leads to, via competition, leads to innovation, etc., etc. And that's precisely what we have learned the last 20 years in particular. But I think strategists had known it for a much longer time, because every handbook of strategy is about, not necessarily about innovating, but is about how to neutralize competition. So it's truly a preconceived notion, a framing, that capitalism via competition leads to innovation and therefore is superior.
Now, it can be said that financial markets are increasingly more important in the way that we make decisions. And taking your notions from competition and capitalism with respect to the financial markets, you could say that within these financial markets there is a lot of competition, but at the same time, the banks and other financial institutions hold a certain monopoly over the way that money gets transferred around the system, etc. What do you think about that? Do you think it's a good idea? How do we actually kind of tackle that monopoly of the banking system?
That's a very good question. Maybe one step back. Do not interpret my comments as being anti-capitalism. My comments are very much about how we should take care of whatever system we have. And we know that a state-led system, a top-down state-led system, has enormous disadvantages, inefficiencies. Therefore, I rather start with the private initiative of capitalism and try to improve that system. With respect to the financial sector, a few dimensions are reinforced in a sense in the financial sector. First, and that just to be very critical of the current financial system, if in the current discussion, because of the difficulties that European banks had over the last 15 years, European banks are currently being talked about as being zombies, having very low value, being very inefficient, etc., etc. And then very often people point at the US, because US banks have a much higher market value, meaning the value of their stock, their shares, relative to what they own. And it's being interpreted as US banks having become much more resilient, having become much more efficient, etc. And here you can have the same story. US banks have done rent seeking to the ultimate extent. And what's rent seeking? Rent seeking is literally that, particularly in the last few years, it has been further fueled, is that consumer protection in the US is very weak, which means that US banks basically have been able to sell financial products in the most negative interpretation to the middle class, let them eat credit. So they have been able to sell financial products at very high cost to the general population. And they have been able to do that because there was not a counterweight against the market power they had. So this is extreme rent seeking, which we have seen in the Dutch market as well. But in the Dutch market, we saw it particularly in the insurance industry, where life insurance, we called it in Dutch woekerpolicies, where 7.5 million life insurance policies have been sold to the Dutch population with an implicit cost structure that went up to 40% of the contribution. So 40% of the money that was supposed to be invested for the customer was not being invested, was taken away as cost. So this is what you call rent seeking. And that we have seen in the financial sector. We have seen that to an enormous extent. European banks currently are much more scrutinized, so they have much more difficulty, but they have lost trust of society. So the financial sector has a very difficult time. And if I give the interpretation over the last 30 years, what has happened, finance has become an activity for itself. So the financial sector was basically doing finance for itself. So finance came unrooted from the real economy. So it was no longer facilitating reallocations, allocations in the real economy, which is the whole of finance, but finance became leading. Finance basically was overruling the real economy and disturbing, therefore, the real economy, because finance can be very short-term oriented, You can just trade in the financial market one evening. Those are transactions. And the real economy, these are always more long-term decisions. So finance got all the power. The real economy lost power. And finance, without being rooted in the real economy, cannot serve the real economy. And that's what we have observed.
So these, the decoupling you mentioned of the financial sector from the real economy has taken place over the last couple of years, with financialization, or the financial sector becoming a sector which serves itself instead of the real economy. Yet at the same time, I noticed that you talk a bit about morals and a bit about the way how people behave and should behave within within the financial sector. Do you agree that to some extent although the financial sector has decoupled from the real economy, its transactionalist behavior within the financial sector has maybe bled through within society? Have we become, as a society, more transactional as of the way that this emphasis on competition and this ruthlessness within the financial sector has been held into high regard over the last 20, 30 years?
Yes, I wouldn't link it to more competition in the financial sector, because the financial sector has not been operating based on competition. The financial sector has been operating based on power, based on connections, based on government connections, all kinds of connections. So basically all types of things that basically have decoupled it from competition. And that you also see, because you see very high margins in a variety of financial activities that cannot be easily explained. This development has been going on actually for the last 20, 30 years. It's not just the last few years. It's a long-term development, and the long-term development there's always reinforcement. So once the financial sector becomes too dominant, financial sector is transaction-oriented, typically. That's the way it has developed. Once it becomes too dominant, it is going to affect the real economy because it likes to do transactions. And transaction you can do transactions by merging, by acquisitions, by selling off business units, etc., etc. And there, the role of finance reinforces the transaction orientation of the real economy. So that's one thing. And the other thing is these reinforcements you really have to identify, because otherwise you cannot understand why maybe 25 years after the Second World War, there were very few problems, and then suddenly there are many problems. And what happened to finance? So people will say, oh, there was deregulation starting in the 1980s. But the deregulation didn't come out of nowhere. Typically, deregulation is a political process and it follows forces in society. And one of the important forces that we have seen in the last 25, 30 years is information technology, the role of information technology. And one of the prime things that information technology does is it facilitates markets, particularly also financial markets. You can trade anything, any moment. And the same applies to business units. You can easily sell now business units in the real economy. So being able to transact, and transact is all short-term oriented, leads to pressure because the finance people want to have more transactions, also want to have more transaction in the real economy, and technology has facilitated it. And given the technology, the regulation became outdated and it was being reinterpreted as we need deregulation.
Thank you, Mr. Boot. We will now proceed with Natasha, and we'll come back to that later. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let's go back to Irene van Staveren. So both of you have sketched the problems you have with the notion of capitalism and the way it functions at this moment, which also hopefully gives us as moderators kind of an agenda to talk with all these leading economists around the world, which we will interview the coming weeks. So let's now use the coming 15 minutes, 20 minutes to actually think of what are elements of rethinking that capitalist problem, the problems you sketched. And let's look for new models, maybe new practices, new institutional arrangements. So let's first go to you, Irene. Perhaps you want to respond to Mr. Boot first. Let me check that. And after that, I would like to ask you to look at those two culprits you mentioned, which was also by close reading, Das Kapital again, how we can actually overcome that, those two culprits in practice, in for instance, regulation. But first, your response to Boot's statement.
Well, I think we very much agree on the issue that in capitalism, the major game is to kill competition. And interestingly, that was exactly a prediction by Karl Marx. Then once we see that, then you see that generally policymakers have a kind of policy making that always runs late. So when some, say, two big firms decide to merge, then only then the European Commission, for example, commissioner concerned with competition, checks whether that is allowed or not. But because of globalization, or in Europe, banks operating on a European scale, there is always the argument, well, perhaps in a national market we become too big, but not at European scale or at the world level. And so that argument, unfortunately, often wins. So that we have ended up with a couple of giants who completely killed competition. So I think we need to consider a more fundamental solution to this problem of killing competition. And that brings me back to the second part of your question. When you signal that there are two driving mechanisms in capitalism, then addressing these in economic practice may actually move firms away from gaming competition. So let me give a couple of examples. I mentioned these two mechanisms. One typical capitalist mechanism is that capital hires labor and not the other way around. And that is exactly why capitalists, to name them like this, or the shareholders of large firms, for example, are able to kill competition because capital is very mobile, moves across the world in seconds, labor not. So labor is stopped at our borders. So we need to rethink models, business models, in which capital and labor are on an equal footing. And there are models like that, both in terms of the structure of firms as well as in business models. One is employee cooperatives. And I don't say cooperatives because Rabobank, for example, is very proud to say it's a cooperative firm, but it's not owned by the employees. It's neither owned by the customers. So employee cooperative firms. And there are some that are very successful. Mondragon Society in Spain, 80,000 members. They also tend to be more resilient during crisis. Of that, Rabobank is to some extent an example. But also consumer investment cooperatives. Think about the wind energy cooperatives owned by a neighborhood, a village, a city of Copenhagen, for example. Second, business models in which the shares are not publicly tradable, but they are under the stewardship of a separate entity that guards the mission of a business, the steward ownership model. Triodos Bank in the Netherlands is an example. Or what about the SEMCO model developed by Brazilian entrepreneur Ricardo Semler with a very horizontal self-management? Or finally, and obviously, state-owned companies. Not all state-owned companies, but state-owned companies with a long-term vision and taking a stakeholders approach. So there's already 4 different types of firms compared to the standard publicly owned firm, for example.
Of course, Irene, the question is, if that asymmetry between capital and labor, if you think that is one of the basic problems of capitalism as we know it, and the consequence of that, for instance, is the killing of competition, and these 4 alternatives you sketch, you say, yeah, it's an alternative for what we find normal, right? The publicly owned company or the shareholder companies. How can we actually create that the future in which these kinds of companies are the norm, and these kinds of companies in which the balance between capital and labor is improved? How can we create that future? What kind of institutional arrangements do we need to change? What kind of policy, laws?
Yeah. Well, as economists, we often think about incentives, and fiscal policy is full of incentives.
Yes.
So we might think of fiscal policies discouraging certain types of firms and encouraging others, which is actually already happening in some ways. So I think, yeah, we should use common policy measures. I can't just think out of the blue about completely new policy instruments. So we should use the current set of policy instruments that we have. But perhaps if I may give some practice examples for the second driving mechanism of capitalism, that may spur creativity a bit more. So firms for which the commodity or the service is central, and for which profit making is a precondition to exist in the long run, right? So a basic profit rate that allows a firm to sustain itself over time. Examples are sustainable energy firms. In the Netherlands, we have, for example, Pure Energie, which ranks #1 for several years on the greenest energy supplier, but also Van de Bron, that brings together consumers and producers for energy. Circular economies are completely around the service of a good, so not the good itself, but you pay for the services. But also, when I think about agriculture, there are a couple of farms in the Netherlands, or groups of collectives of farms, where consumers come and help at the farm, and they pick their own vegetables from the garden, and they're kind of member of the farm.
Okay, clear. But this is still a niche, right? I mean, we here in Pakhuis de Zwijger, of course, we have put all these initiatives many times on the stage, right, as an alternative. But how do they become a tour de force to actually create the change we want? And let me go to Mr. Boot. Perhaps he has an idea, because he also said we need to, well, let's say, change some of the ways we deal with looking at the economy, right? I mean, how can we, for instance, change the way the dominance of the financial sector as we know it, and make it much more balanced with the real economy activities? What kind of changes do you foresee?
Yeah, let me add a few things to what Irene said.
Yes.
Let's be careful that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And what I mean with that is I'm not defending necessarily the system today, but I do defend the notions of entrepreneurship, which does depend on private ownership. SMEs are crucially important for the economy. Family corporations crucially important for the economy. Are we going to say that there's something wrong with all these companies and that the labor that they hire should be co-owners of these businesses? No, there is no need for that. So we need diversity in the corporate landscape, diversity. So sometimes co-ownership, mutual ownership, employee ownership is optimal. There are things that you can organize among yourself, also given the technology today. Technology today is very often interpreted as something that makes things bigger financial institutions, and that's possible because of technology. But that's only half the story. The other half of the story is that because the same technology you can arrange in your own community, in your own group with similar interest, you can organize your pension arrangement because the same technology. So you can organize things among yourselves. And that's in a sense part of the economy that you want to have. You want to have the people, you want them to be involved. And how do you get involvement? And how do you get community involvement? It is technology can help you. And there are many types of things that you can organize in your own environment, like your collective pensions. Doesn't have to be done by a big insurance company. The big insurance company can be hired to do the back office, but how you organize it and the trustees you put in place to monitor your arrangements among your group, you can do yourself based on technology. So yes, grassroots, more involvement, member cooperatives, it's great. Wherever possible, do it. In many types of things, you will not do it. It's not a problem because that's the SME business. And if there is somebody with a great idea, let them go after it and let them hire a few people, etc., etc. That's how we get new businesses. With respect to the big businesses, there is one thing different today compared to the lessons of in the very early part of last century, and that's antitrust policy. Antitrust policy is crucially important. In Google and Amazon, these big companies get market power, and they have a public role. And the public role, that's the crucial thing, needs to be checked. There need to be checks and balances. That's why you have antitrust policy. And the same dominance that has given business basically market power, the ability to charge rents, has also succeeded in muting antitrust policy. So there are things that we can do without suggesting that we are on the wrong planet.
One last topic I would like to raise is which was started actually by Jim Suri, who opened this evening. And he said, of course, if he looks at what the market economy, the capitalist system is producing today, if he looks at it, he sees inequality, he sees destruction. And he says, apparently it's not possible, if we look at the way capitalism is organized now, to stay within the planetary boundaries to create social justice. It's not solving real problems. So why do we have an economy if it's not solving real problems? Can you respond to that? Do you agree with that? And if so, what needs to change in the way we organize the markets, that they actually start producing more just results?
You asked a question to me, just that I don't jump into Irene's position first.
Yeah.
Okay. There is an imbalance. There is an imbalance, and that particularly also relates back to your question about finance. Finance, you need to have a pace in finance. Finance is too fast. It's too fast. And that also applies to the role of shareholders. If shareholders can get in and out at every second, there is no time element. It becomes a very short-term oriented type of approach. There is also no commitment in that case. And so we need to get more commitment. And what commitment does, it creates a longer-term horizon, And the longer-term horizon is precisely what we need to address issues like sustainability and climate, because those can only be addressed if we build in the longer-term horizon. And then we can start very simply in my country, in the Netherlands. The pension funds, which are semi-public, because there's a public system, but the pension funds are formally private, they have 2.5 times GDP as assets to invest. If they do not manage to invest for the long term and follow clear policies with respect to the environment, if they cannot do it, the situation will be hopeless. Because they have this money for the long term, they have a protected position in the sense that the money cannot run away, and they have a public role. So we have to mobilize these things in society that would put the right pace in finance. And there are several hooks we can link up to. And one hook is, for example, these pension funds, which in this country have a very dominant role.
Irene van Staveren, what is your take on my question about that the results which this capitalist system is producing are clearly unfair and even destructive, as Jim would say?
Yeah. I very much agree. That's why I think we need to have a very different economy that is not capitalist, but that is still based on markets, and a better balance between markets, the state, and including an effective antitrust policy, because obviously, if you look at the dominance of big firms, some big firms in some sectors like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Shell, Unilever, we don't have an effective antitrust policy. So effective government role and an effective role, more space for communities. And that is what you see, for example, in the community-owned wind energy and so on. I know it's small scale now, but I want to get away from the trap that a non-capitalist economy kills entrepreneurship. It's not true at all. A market economy stimulates entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship, innovation is a characteristic of markets, not necessarily of
capitalism. Yeah, thank you for clarifying your position. It's quite clear, and also it's interesting, of course, to see your vision next to that of Mr. Boot. Let's go back. Let's go to the closing of this session, and we've invited Jim back at our table, and of course, David and I are very curious. You started the evening. Did you hear things which were somehow answering your cri de coeur, I would say, in your column?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I thought the answers of both people were very inspiring, and I wrote some things down, which I think can be thought for again. So it was said that we're out of balance, and I think that's the key here.
Yeah.
And I think we're kind of trapped in how we think about the system that we're living in. So most of the people think, like Irene said before, if there's not capitalism, you must have communism. But there are just a lot of other ways to think about how a societal model can work. And I also was inspired by Irene when she said, you have to start with goods instead of start with capital. And I think we might have to shift to a nature-based economy, where indeed we have to start with how many resources do we have, how many people are they, and what kind of technology can we use in order to make an efficient way to use these resources in order to fulfill the needs of everyone. And the balance of labor and capital as well, I think that's crucial. There's a huge imbalance between the capital of some people and the labor forces of a lot of other peoples as well. Another thing that I thought of was the systems in education. So, for example, within my university study, I was also brought up to think about profit maximization or cost reduction. And for example, we just had to rethink about how to make a pasta machine. And the main goal there was to make a machine that will break down in 5 years, for example, in order to make another one, so that you can maximize your profit. But I think that's in a complete wrong way to think about.
When did you do your studies? In what year this assignment was given to you?
Which year?
Is it like 10 years ago? It can't be, because you're very young.
2013.
Yeah, so 7 years ago, it was still very normal for a professor at an educational institution in the Netherlands to ask this question: design a product which breaks down in 5 years.
It is, yeah.
Okay, now just to know what the state of the educational system is, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I also think when I look to the educational system, most of the courses are completely focused on rational ways of looking to the world.
Yeah.
But no arguments are made about how you really feel about it or your intuition. And I think that's also a lack of thinking, because a lot of students has to think in a certain set of way. But yeah, I think that's not an optimal way.
Yeah. What, David?
Yeah, I think that's very true, right? Economics tends to think about itself in a very transactional or very rational way. And but what I think I heard from Ms. van Staveren and Mr. Boot tonight is that there's also a requirement of other values, of things which are probably immeasurable, which cannot be measured, which cannot be rationalized away or dealt with in that fashion. So there are other notions which we have to take into account. And I was wondering, Jim, you started off your column with kind of a need for a paradigm shift, and you remained very hopeful at the beginning of your column. Do you still remain hopeful after hearing what Ms. van Staveren and Mr. Boot told us tonight?
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, I think it's crucial to keep your hope. Otherwise, you can't fix things.
Of course. Do you think it's still viable? Do you think there are viable alternatives that Mrs. van Staveren and Mr. Boot have brought to the table?
Yeah. I heard some good ideas, but I didn't hear like a very simple thing about taxes, right? For example, Rutger Bregman brought it up at the World Economic Forum. I think it's a really simple way to redistribute wealth. Another thing I thought about was, if you redistribute wealth, you don't have to look only to your own country, but also the effects for other countries as well. For example, Africa is the richest continent on planet Earth based on the amount of natural resources, but they don't get the wealth from it. So, and of course, we in Europe do benefit from those natural resources.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, they are now just looking at us. But of course, Mr. Boot already said it's not about fairness. These systems. Yeah. For that, you need policies, and of course, the fiscal policies were mentioned a bit by Van Staveren. What do you want to give us, the group who's rethinking, but what should we emphasize if you're thinking about your column, this conversation? What should we research more into detail the coming 10 weeks?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because the relationship, for instance, with continents like Africa is interesting, right? I mean, how do you create some kind of global relationship or moral fairness?
I think we need to think about the effects of our own actions again, and because the world is so big and there are such a lot of people, it gets quite anonymous, so you don't really know what the effects are from your own actions.
Yeah.
So I think that's a consciousness.
Yeah. That was really clear in your column, that there is a relationship between your personal morality and your personal leadership and the way systems operate in, for instance, a capitalist market economy.
Yeah, what struck me also from what Mr. Bodas told us is that there seems to be a necessity to break the power of some of these monopolies which have grown over time, these big firms. And perhaps what I would find interesting, if we could further elaborate on that in the coming 10 weeks, is maybe we need to also move beyond just individual morality and find some collectivist ideas in which we can break this power, because the power can only be broken as a collective and probably not on an individual level as a consumer. Yeah. That would be something for me which I would find rather interesting to
explore. Yeah, interesting. This is it. I would like to thank our fantastic speakers who are here through video conferencing in their own homes. Thank you so much for participating in this kickoff. Thank you so much for your inspiring kickoff column, and of course you, David. Thank you for your interesting interviews. Next week we will be back with the first official edition of the series, and then we will interview Joseph Stiglitz and Herman van Rompuy. They will be with us. Find coming editions of these series online through deswijger.nl, and for more information on future markets consultation, go to moralmarkets.org/future markets consultation. Thank you for watching and have a great night.